You put that coat on him, Harmon, and I'll end your shift and your job in the same breath.
Try me. It's 12 degrees, Chet.
I don't care if it's 40 below. He's a non-rider, terminal's closed, and you're out of position. And that backs me up either way it goes. Move him along, or I move you.
So write it up.
You've got a kid to feed! You really want to throw away a paycheck over a man who's going to be dead in a doorway by February no matter what you do tonight? You can't carry him. You can't carry any of them. I've watched 100 of them blow through this terminal, so you don't try. That's the whole job, Harmon. You keep the building safe, and you do not get attached to what the cold drags in.
For 1 second, Cody stopped, because there was a 7-year-old girl standing 10 feet away, watching her father decide what kind of man he was. "Daddy," Ruby said, very small. "He's the coldest one." That decided it. Cody stepped around his supervisor. He crouched down, and he laid the coat across a stranger's shoulders. "Get your pen then," he said low. "But he's wearing my coat while you write." "Harmon, that's not a trespasser, Chet." Cody's voice had gone flat and quiet, the way it did when something in him had already broken clean through. "Look at how he's sitting. You hold a post enough years. Your spine never forgets how, not even at 79, not even freezing. That's a soldier. And I don't walk past a soldier in the cold. You can fire me standing right here, and I'll still turn his collar up before I go." The old man's head came up, pale eyes, furious, in a face like cracked leather. "Keep your coat, son. I don't take charity." "It's not charity. It's 12 degrees. Call it a loan. 22 years I wore the uniform." The old man said it to Chet, not to Cody, like a man setting a card face-up on a table. "Master Sergeant, you want to write me up too? You go right ahead. I've been written up by better men than you, in worse weather than this." Something moved behind Chet Loomis's eyes. Something that flickered and hurt and got shoved back down, hard. And for a moment, the big man couldn't find his script. Then he retreated into it, the way frightened men do. 10 minutes, he said, already backing toward the doors. Then he's gone. The girl's off my platform, and this never happened. I'm doing you a favor I shouldn't. And he went inside, because inside was easier than standing in the cold beside a thing he did not want to feel. "He has another coat at home," Ruby informed the old man, creeping in the instant her father's boss was gone. "It has a hole in it, but you get the good one, because you're the coldest one. That's different from being a stranger." Something cracked in the old man's granite face. He looked at the little girl a long moment, and he stopped arguing, and he pulled the parka closed with hands that didn't work right anymore. "Your daddy raised you to talk to strangers? You're not a stranger. You're the coldest one." The old man grunted, tugging the coat tighter in spite of himself. "You'll freeze without it, son. I've got a truck with a heater that mostly works. You've got a bench. The math's easy." Cody didn't know that the man in front of him was a ghost the United States Army had been hunting for 41 years. He didn't know that, by morning, a general would be calling his phone. He only knew it was too cold for a person to sit in, that he had a coat, and that somewhere his own father was watching. To understand why Cody Harmon would give away his only coat to a man who cursed him for it, you have to know about his father. Cal Harmon had been a soldier once. He came home from a war the country was already busy forgetting. And he came home wrong, in the quiet way a lot of them did. And there was no word for it then that anybody used out loud. He tried. God, he tried. The jobs, the church basements, the pills that helped, and the drink that didn't. But the world had a way of looking straight through a man like Cal, a man who'd given it something enormous and gotten a folded flag's worth of thanks, and then a lifetime of doors that didn't open. By the time Cody was a boy, his father was a man the neighbors crossed the street to avoid, a man who slept some nights on a bench by the river because the apartment got too small around his own head. He remembered the last clear conversation they'd had, a few months before the end. His father had been sitting by the window in the dark, watching the street the way he always did. "Come here. Sit with your old man a minute." Cody had sat. You know why I watch the street? No, Dad. Habit. You stand enough watches, you never really stand down. Part of you's always out on the wire, listening for the guys who didn't come in yet. He'd been quiet a long moment. That's the thing nobody warns you about, coming home, son. Half of you still out there, standing a post nobody ever relieves you from. And the world walks by and sees a broken man on a bench. They don't see a soldier who never got the order to come in. He looked at Cody with a terrible clarity. Don't you ever walk past a man like that. He's still standing his watch. He just can't find his way in from the cold. Cody was 14. He hadn't understood. He'd said, "Okay, Dad, the way you do." Cody was 14 too. The winter his father died on one of those benches, alone, of nothing more complicated than cold and a heart that had quietly given up. Nobody at the service wore a uniform. Nobody called him a hero. The county buried him in a plot with a number, and the world closed over the space where Cal Harmon had been, like water over a dropped stone, and 14-year-old Cody stood there and understood, in a way that never left him, that a person could give everything and still be allowed to disappear. His father had said one thing to him, more than once, back when he still had the words. He'd say it standing at the window at night, watching the street like it was a perimeter. You don't leave a man alone at his post, Cody. Whatever else you forget in this life, not that. Cody hadn't understood it as a boy. He understood it now. It was the only thing his father had left him, and he had built his entire life around not breaking it. So he became the kind of man who stopped. He wasn't much else the world would brag about. Divorced young when Ruby's mother decided at 23 that she wasn't built for any of it and drove off toward a bigger life. A night guard on a wage that ran out 3 days before the month did. A man who felt most days like exactly the kind of nobody his son should be ashamed of. His life was small and it was hard, and it ran on a razor. He worked the graveyard shift because it paid $1 more an hour, and because it meant he could walk Ruby to school in the morning before he slept. He knew the exact price of everything in the discount grocery and the exact number of days until the water bill turned into a shut-off notice. He cut his own hair. He kept the truck alive with junkyard parts and stubbornness. On the good nights, he stood in the fluorescent quiet of the terminal and felt like a man holding a wall up with his bare back. And on the bad nights, he lay in the dark and did the arithmetic of his failures and heard his father's silence in the next room of his memory. He had never once believed he was anything special. The world had been very clear with him on that point, the way it is clear with men who clean up after other people's journeys and are not thanked. The only thing he had that felt like worth was this. He did not walk past. Whatever else he was or wasn't, he had held that one line his father drew, and some nights it was the only thing that let him sleep. He lay awake, sometimes terrified that he was giving Ruby the same inheritance he'd gotten, a father the world looked through. But he could not, would not, walk past a cold man, especially not one who stood like a soldier. The 10 minutes Chet had given him came and went, and Cody Harmon did not move the old man along. He worked his own gloves onto the veteran's ruined hands instead, and then he did the thing that was going to cost him his job, the thing no clipboard rule was old enough to stop, because his father had left him exactly one instruction in this life, and it outranked every policy anyone had ever written down. "Come on," he said, offering his arm. "It's warmer inside. I make bad coffee, but a lot of it." He was not supposed to bring a non-rider into the closed waiting area. He did it anyway. He got the old man into a molded plastic chair under a heater that half worked, and he poured coffee from his own thermos into the thermos cup and pressed it into those shaking hands. And Ruby sat down in the next chair over and swung her feet and studied their guest like a scientist. "What's your name?" she asked. The old man looked at the coffee for a while before he answered, and when he did, his voice had gone strange, like a door, opening on a room nobody had been in for years. "Kane," he said. "Otis Kane. I'm Ruby. That's my daddy, Cody. He guards the buses at night, so nobody's scared." "Does he?" Otis Kane looked at Cody over the girl's head, and something passed between the two men, some recognition that didn't need words. That's a real job, guarding, standing a post in the dark so other people can sleep. Not everybody can do it. He said it like it mattered, like it was the highest thing he knew, and Cody felt his throat go tight for reasons he couldn't have explained to anybody. They talked, the three of them, in the fluorescent hum of a closed bus terminal for the better part of an hour. Or Ruby talked, and Otis answered, and Cody listened. "Were you really in the army?" Ruby asked. 22 years. "Did you have a gun?" "Ruby," Cody said. "It's all right." Otis almost smiled, the first one, and it changed his whole face. "I had a lot of things, girl. A rifle, a pack, 80 pounds of gear, and a canteen that always leaked. But you know what I carried the most?" "What?" "Other people." The old man turned the coffee cup in his ruined hands. "Everybody thinks a soldier's job is fighting. It isn't. It's carrying. You carry the wounded. You carry the tired. You carry the scared kid who signed up at 18 because he had nowhere else to go. You leave your own gear in the mud and you carry the man next to you home. That's the whole job." "That sounds heavy," Ruby said. "Heaviest thing there is." He looked into the cup. "And you never get to put it down. Not even when it's over. Not even 40 years later. You just keep carrying them. In here." He touched his chest. "Some of them you couldn't carry fast enough. Those weigh the most. You carry those the longest." Cody said quietly, "Sounds like you're still carrying somebody, Sergeant." Otis Kane looked at him, and for a second, the fury drained out of the pale eyes and left only the tiredness underneath. "Aren't you?" he said, and Cody, thinking of a bench by a river, said, "Yeah, I am." The old man didn't say much about himself after that, and Cody didn't push. He knew the shape of a man who'd rather not be asked. But once, when Ruby wanted to know if he'd ever been in the army for real, Otis Kane went still, and then he reached into some inner pocket of layered rags with great care and brought out a small dark disc of metal, worn smooth as a river stone. "You know what this is?" Ruby shook her head. "It's a challenge coin. A soldier carries it. It says what unit you were, who you stood with. You give one to somebody, it means—" His voice caught. "It means you'd have gone back for them. It means they mattered." He turned it over in the light. Cody could see the markings were nearly gone, rubbed away by decades of a thumb worrying at it. "I gave a lot of these out, a long time ago, to men I stood with. This is the last one I've got left." "It's pretty," Ruby said softly, and Otis Kane, 79 years old, who had not accepted a kindness in longer than the child had been alive, pressed his last challenge coin into Ruby Harmon's small hand and closed her fingers over it. "You keep that," he said, rough. "A soldier pays what he owes. Your daddy gave me his coat. I don't have much, but I've got this, and now you've got it. Don't you lose it." "Sir, you don't have to—" Cody started. "Yes, I do." The old man's eyes were wet and fierce. "You don't understand, son. Nobody's owed me a debt in 40 years. Nobody's even looked at me long enough to owe me one. You let me pay one tonight. You don't know what you gave me." He wrapped both his hands around Ruby's fist with the coin inside it. "Now, you take care of that. And you take care of your daddy. A man who stops in the cold, that's a rare man. That's the whole ballgame, right there." Cody had to turn away and pretend to check the coffee, because his father was suddenly very close in that room, and he could not let a stranger see his face. Later, when the old man dozed in the plastic chair, Cody stepped into the corner with his phone. He didn't know what else to do. He couldn't take Otis home. He could barely keep his own lights on. He couldn't leave him on the platform. So he did the one thing he could think of. He called the Veterans Crisis and Outreach line, the number he'd memorized years too late to help his own father. And he stayed on hold in the cold corner of a closed terminal for 19 minutes. And when a tired, kind voice finally answered, he gave them everything he had. "His name's Otis Kane. Says he was a master sergeant, 22 years. He's elderly. He's on the street, and it's going to kill him this winter if somebody doesn't get to him. He read them the few numbers he could still make out on the coin, squinting, holding it to the light, calling them off like a man reciting the only prayer he knew. That's all I've got. Please, please don't let this one disappear. I already watched one man disappear. I can't do it twice. He left his own name and his own number, and he made them write it down twice. He didn't know it, but at that moment, in a record system nobody had queried in years, an old flag woke up. The call came the next morning at 8:14, while Cody was making Ruby's eggs on his day off, running on 2 hours of sleep. The coin sitting on the counter where Ruby had insisted on displaying it. The number was blocked. He almost didn't answer. When he did, a crisp voice on the other end said, "Am I speaking with Cody Harmon?" "Yeah. Who's this?" "Mr. Harmon, my name is Loretta Ames. I'm calling from Fort—" A pause, a word he didn't catch, his heart already going sideways. "Mr. Harmon, I need to ask you some questions about a call you placed last night to a veterans outreach line about a man named Otis Kane." And Cody Harmon, who had spent his whole life being the kind of man institutions called only when something was wrong, felt the old dread rise in his chest. "Look, I just see, if I broke some rule, if I wasn't supposed to give out his information, I'm sorry. I was just trying to—" "Mr. Harmon." The voice softened, and under the crispness, he heard something that took him a second to identify, because he'd never once heard it aimed at him from a voice like that. It was awe. "I'm not calling because you did something wrong. I'm calling because you may have just found a man I have been looking for, personally, for 41 years. I'm a general in the United States Army, and Master Sergeant Otis Kane is the reason I'm alive to be one." "Ma'am, I think you've got the wrong person," Cody said. "I'm nobody. I'm a night guard at a bus terminal. You're the man who gave Otis Kane your coat and read his coin numbers to a hotline at 1 in the morning and wouldn't hang up," Ames said. "That makes you the most important phone call I've made in 41 years. So I'll ask you again, and think before you answer. Where is he right now?" The eggs burned. Cody didn't notice. She told him some of it on the phone, and more of it later, and the shape of it was this. 41 years ago, in a war Cody's own father had come home broken from, a young medic named Loretta Ames had been pinned down with her unit in a place that should have been the end of all of them. Their line broke, men were down in the open, and a master sergeant named Otis Kane had gone back out into it, not once, the way a story usually goes, but again and again and again, dragging the wounded to cover one at a time until every living man was accounted for. He'd carried Loretta Ames out over his shoulder with her leg in pieces. 11 men owed him their lives that day. And then Otis Kane had done the thing that made him a legend and a ghost at once. He'd refused all of it. The medals, the ceremony, the write-up. Because one man hadn't made it. One man Otis couldn't reach in time. And a certain kind of soldier cannot be decorated for a day he counts as a failure. He'd finished his 22 years quiet, and then his wife had died. And then his grief had done to him what grief does, and Otis Kane had walked out of every record the Army kept, and vanished into the exact invisibility that swallows men who've given everything. His old unit had never stopped looking. Ames, rising through the ranks, had kept a standing alert on his name and his coin numbers for 4 decades, a flag most people told her to let go. "People disappear, Mr. Harmon," she said, "especially the ones who gave the most. The system loses them and the world lets it." Last night, for the first time in 41 years, his name came back up. Because a night watchman read 9 worn digits off a coin to a hotline and wouldn't hang up. A pause. "Where is he now?" And Cody's stomach dropped, because he had the answer, and it was the wrong one. "I don't know," he said. "I put him inside last night. When my shift ended at 6, I walked him out to the platform, told him I'd bring him breakfast, told him to wait right there. He was already standing, already reaching for his boots. "General, he's gone. He wasn't there this morning. I checked. He's gone." Because that is what men like Otis Kane do. They do not stay to be found. Being found means being seen, and being seen means being owed. And a man who has spent 40 years believing he failed, the one that mattered, cannot bear to be told he's a hero. So sometime in that black pre-dawn, Otis Kane had folded a stranger's parka neatly on the bench and walked back out into the cold and disappeared the way he'd disappeared from everything, because he'd let himself be a person for 1 hour and it had cost him too much. The days that followed were the hardest Cody had known since he was 14. He went back to work and found Chet Loomis waiting with a suspension notice. 2 weeks, unpaid, pending review, Chet said, and he couldn't quite meet Cody's eye. You left your post. You brought a non-rider and a minor into a secured area after hours. It's on camera. My hands are tied, Harmon. I told you not to get involved. I told you. You did, Cody said. You told me. He took the paper. 2 weeks unpaid was the difference between making rent and not, and they both knew it. For what it's worth, Chet, the man I got involved with, carried 11 soldiers out of a firefight on his back. There's a general on a plane right now because of him. But you're right. Rules are rules. Something crossed Chet Loomis's face. Something that looked almost like pain. And he opened his mouth and then closed it and walked away, because whatever was in him, he wasn't ready to say it yet. It got worse before it got better, the way these things do. Somebody at the outreach line or the terminal talked. The story got out in the small way stories do now. Night guard gives coat to homeless vet. Turns out to be a war hero. And for about 72 hours, Cody Harmon was a thing people wanted a piece of. A local producer left 3 voicemails about a feel-good segment. And a man in an expensive coat found him at the terminal 2 nights later and talked fast. Cody Harmon. What you did. Beautiful. And beautiful things have a shelf life, so we move now. Picture it. A fund. Your face, the little girl, the coin. We clear 6 figures in a week. People eat this up. Eat what up? The moment. The feels. You, the hero. I'm not the hero. Cody didn't raise his voice. It went flat the way it did. There's a 79-year-old man out there in the cold tonight who ran into gunfire 11 times so other men's kids could grow up with fathers. He's the story. And right now, he's freezing in a doorway somewhere while you want to put my face on a coffee mug. Right. We mentioned the vet. The vet's the emotional core. But the hook is you, the everyman, the get out of my terminal. And Cody, who had spent his whole life terrified of being the nobody the world looked through, discovered that being suddenly, briefly looked AT felt even worse. Because not one of them was looking at Otis. They were looking at the story. Every one of them would have stepped over the actual man on the actual bench. They wanted the warm ending. They did not want to go out in the cold and earn it. So they went away. And then the bottom fell out. A week in, suspended and broke. Cody stood at his kitchen counter at 3 a.m, and Ruby padded out in her socks and climbed up on the stool and looked at the coin she kept there. And she asked the question he'd been dreading. Daddy, where did the coin man go? I don't know, baby. Is he still cold? And Cody Harmon, 36 years old, could not answer her, because the honest answer was that he was probably dead in a doorway somewhere. One more soldier the world had let disappear, and Cody had done exactly what he'd sworn his whole life he'd never do. He'd let a man walk off his post alone. He'd stood at the window like his father used to, watching a perimeter he couldn't hold, and he understood with a cold and total clarity that some inheritances you don't escape. You just repeat them, 1 generation down in a smaller apartment. He thought about calling the general back, and didn't, because what was there to say? I found the man you spent 41 years looking for, and then I turned my back for 1 shift, and now he's gone the way they all go? He thought about the coat, folded so neat. On that bench in the dark, a folded coat is what a man leaves behind when he has decided, quietly and for good, to stop being a burden to anybody ever again. Cody had learned to read that particular language young. He had spent his entire life swearing he would not become his father. And here he was anyway, 36 years old and standing at a black window watching a perimeter he couldn't hold, having let one more soldier walk off into the cold alone. The inheritance had come for him after all. It had just waited, patient as winter, until he'd let his guard down for exactly one night. He put his face in his hands at the kitchen counter, and his little girl put her small hand on the back of his neck, the way you gentle a spooked animal, and she said, "Daddy, you didn't leave him. You gave him your coat. That's not leaving." And that undid him completely, because it was the kindest and least true thing anyone had ever said to him. And he wept at his own counter with his daughter's hand on his neck, and a dead soldier's coin catching the light between them. What Cody didn't know was that General Loretta Ames did not give up on people the way the world did. It was the one thing Otis Kane had taught her that she'd built her whole life around. While Cody sat suspended and grieving, Ames worked. She was a woman who could move an institution, and she moved it. She pulled the outreach call, the coin numbers, the flag. She had people walking the shelters and the hospital intake lists and the Potter's Field registries, because she knew, better than anyone, exactly how a forgotten soldier disappears and exactly where the system files him when it's done losing him. She knew because she had spent a career studying the arithmetic of the lost. A man like Otis Kane does not vanish all at once. He is subtracted slowly, one institution at a time. First, the Army loses track of him when he refuses to be found. Then the VA loses him when he stops filing the paperwork that proves he still exists. Then the city loses him into the churn of shelters that only keep a name for 30 days. Then the winter takes a run at him, and if it misses, the spring finds him thinner, and the next winter aims better. By the end, he is a John Doe in an intake log, a set of vitals with no history, a man whose entire 40 years of service has been reduced to a blood pressure reading and a question mark. Loretta Ames had watched it happen to men she'd have died for, and she had risen high enough, at last, to fight it. And she had learned that the fight is not won with speeches or budgets, but with the same stubbornness Otis had taught her on a bad afternoon a lifetime ago. You go back in, you go back in, and you go back in, and you go back in, until you have accounted for every last one of your people, or there is no more you left to send. And on the 9th day, in the intake records of a county VA facility on the far side of the city, a name surfaced. An elderly man, no fixed address, brought in by an ambulance 3 nights before, with hypothermia and pneumonia. Unresponsive at first, carrying no ID. The staff had listed him as a John Doe, but when he'd come around enough to speak, the intake nurse had written down the one thing he kept repeating, the only thing he'd say, a name, over and over, like a man trying to hold on to the last warm thing in a cold room. He didn't give his own name. A man who has spent 40 years erasing himself does not suddenly remember he exists. But there was a name he would not let go of, murmuring it through the fever, the way a drowning man holds a rope. And the nurse wrote it on his chart because it was all she had. He kept saying, Ruby. He'd made it inside because a stranger had given him a coat and an hour of being a person. And somewhere down in the fever, he had decided that the little girl who called him the coldest one was worth the humiliating work of staying alive. It is a small thing, being expected by a child. It is also sometimes the only thing, the last handhold a person has left. And it had held him through 3 nights it had no business holding him through. He'd made it inside because a stranger had given him a coat and an hour of being a person. And somewhere in the fever, he'd decided the little girl was worth staying alive for. The coat, folded under his cot, still had Cody's county paycheck stub in the pocket, with a name and a workplace on it. That was how they found the thread. That was how, on a gray afternoon, General Loretta Ames called Cody Harmon a second time and said 4 words that put him on the floor of his own kitchen. We found him. He's alive. There was no marble and no marching band. They held it at the VA, in a plain day room with folding chairs and a taped-up paper banner and a coffee urn in the corner, because Otis Kane was too weak to be moved, and because Ames understood the man well enough to know he'd have refused anything grander. But the room filled anyway. Word travels among a certain kind of people, and by the time it started, there were old men standing along the walls who'd driven half a day to be there, men with unit caps and canes, and the particular still bearing of people who had once carried more than their bodies could hold. Some of them Otis had served with. Most of them had only heard the story, the one that moves through the veteran world like heat through a wire. That Top Kane was alive, that they'd found him, that after 41 years somebody had finally gone back in and brought him home. They came to stand in a room with him. That was all. In their world, standing in the room is the whole language of love, and the room was full of it. She flew in on her own time, in her dress uniform with more ribbons on it than Cody could count, and the first thing she did when she walked into that room, full of brass and staff, was cross straight to a battered old man in a wheelchair, and come to attention, and hold a salute until her arm shook. "Master Sergeant Kane," she said. "It's been a long time, Top." Otis Kane looked at the medic he'd carried out of hell 4 decades ago, now a general, and his cracked face came apart. "You weren't supposed to keep looking, Ames. I told them to let me go." "You never let one of us go," she said. "Not one, not ever. Did you really think we'd let you? I lost Delgado." Otis said the name like a man setting down something he'd carried up a mountain. A name. It was plain. He had not spoken aloud in decades. "On the wire. I couldn't reach him. Went back 4 times and I still couldn't." "I know. I was there." Ames pulled a folding chair close and sat, so she was level with the wheelchair, general and sergeant, knee to knee. "You went back 4 times, Top. 4. There was no 5th trip that brings Delgado home. There was never going to be one. It was the wire in the dark and one bad afternoon, and it was not yours to carry alone for 41 years. Her voice held. "You've served the sentence, longer than any court would have handed down. It's time served, Sergeant. Do you hear me? Time served. You're relieved." And Otis Kane, who had not wept in front of another soldier in his life, put his face in his hands and wept, because someone with the authority to do it had finally given the order he'd been waiting 4 decades to hear: stand down. They'd asked Cody to come, and he'd almost said no. He didn't want to be a segment, didn't want to be looked at. But Ruby had insisted, because Ruby had a coin to return to a man, or so she decided. And you did not argue with Ruby about a debt. So Cody stood at the back in his one clean shirt, with his daughter's hand in his, and he watched a general honor a ghost, and he thought his heart could not hold any more. But Loretta Ames wasn't finished. She turned from Otis, and she found Cody at the back of the room, and she walked the length of it, and then, a 2-star general in her dress uniform, she knelt down on the day-room floor in front of a 7-year-old girl. "You must be Ruby," she said. "I hear you've been keeping something important." Ruby, uncharacteristically shy, opened up her hand. The worn coin sat in her palm, and General Ames reached into her own breast pocket and drew out a coin of her own. Dark, old, its edges soft with 41 years of being carried by a woman who never took it off. And she held it next to Ruby's, and they were the same. The same unit. The same crest, worn nearly smooth. 2 halves of the same impossible promise, 41 years and a whole broken life apart. "He gave me mine the day he carried me out," Ames said, and her general's voice was not steady now. "I've carried it every day since, through every rank, to remind me what the job actually is underneath all of this." She touched the ribbons on her chest. "You know what all of this is for, Ruby? All these medals, this whole enormous army? It's for one thing, and mostly we fail at it, and your daddy did it, in 12-degree weather, with a used coat and no medal at all." She closed Ruby's fingers back over the coin. "You don't leave a man alone at his post. That's the whole thing. That's all it's ever been. Your father knew it without anybody teaching him. Keep that coin. You come from the kind of people who stop. And Cody Harmon, who had spent his whole life certain he was the nobody his son should be ashamed of, watched a general kneel on a floor and tell his daughter that her father was the thing the entire army was trying to be, and he heard his own dead father's exact words come out of a general's mouth, 40 years and 1,000 miles from the window where Cal Harmon first said them, and something that had been broken in him since he was 14, finally, quietly set. It was not a clean and easy ending, because those aren't real. Cody, when they offered him things, a reward fund people had started, a job offer that was really a photo op, a spot in the feel-good segment, reborn now with a happier finale, said no to almost all of it, and he said it in a way that made Ames like him more. "I don't want money for it," he told her. The two of them standing in the VA hallway, while Ruby showed Otis her loose tooth. "If I take a check for giving a man a coat, then it was a transaction, and it wasn't. And there's a version of me that becomes a guy who does kind things for a camera, and I'd rather stay broke than be him. My father was invisible his whole life, General. I'm not going to get visible off this man's back. I understand that better than you know," Ames said, "so I'm not going to offer you a check." She looked at him steadily. "I'm going to offer you work, real work, and hard and mostly thankless. There are thousands of Otis Kanes out there, men and women this country trained to run into fire and then trained itself to look straight through. We lose them in exactly the gap you stood in that night, between it's cold enough to kill him, and that's not our problem. I'm standing up something to find them before the winter does. I need people who can't walk past. That's the whole job description, Mr. Harmon, and it turns out it's the rarest qualification there is." A faint, tired smile. "You'd take a pay cut from security, probably. God help you." "I don't take charity," Cody said, the old reflex. "It's not charity. It's a post," Ames said, "and I'm asking you to stand it. There's a difference. You, of all people, know there's a difference." He thought about a bench by a river. He thought about a folded flag and a numbered plot. He thought about his father at the window, watching a perimeter, saying the only thing he had to give. And Cody Harmon, for the first time in his life, let himself be handed something and did not flinch away from it. "Okay," he said, "okay, I'll stand it." There was Chet too, and Chet was harder, because Chet had to come to it himself. He showed up at the VA on the last afternoon, out of his uniform, holding his cap in his hands like a man at a graveside. He found Cody in the hallway. "I lifted the suspension," he said. "Told the corporate I gave the instruction wrong. It's off your record." "You didn't have to do that." "I did, actually." Chet Loomis looked at the floor, and then he made himself look up, which cost him. "I had a brother, younger. He came back from over there like a lot of them come back, and he ended up on the street. And I told myself the same thing I told you, not my problem. There's a number for that. Don't get attached." His voice went to pieces on the last word. "He died under an overpass 8 blocks from my house, Harmon. While I was keeping my building safe and not getting involved, I've spent 9 years telling every guard who works for me not to do the one thing that might have saved my brother, because if it would have worked for you, then it means it would have worked for me, and I didn't do it." He wiped his face roughly. "I'm sorry. That's not enough, but I'm sorry." Cody was quiet a long moment. He didn't say it's okay, because it wasn't. "There's a woman down the hall," he said finally, "standing up a whole program to find the next one before the cold does. Men just like your brother." He put a hand on the bigger man's shoulder. "You want to do something that's actually enough? Don't say sorry to me. Go tell her about your brother. Put his name on the list of the ones we're doing this for. Then help us find the living ones." He squeezed. "That's a post too, Chet. You can still stand it." Chet Loomis nodded, not trusting his voice, and went down the hall to find the general. Otis Kane lived, that winter and the next. He would not take a medal even then. Some things 40 years don't move. But he let them move him into a small VA residence with heat that worked and a window, and he let Ruby visit, which mattered more. Cody came to understand that the old man had needed exactly one thing to keep breathing, and it wasn't honor, and it wasn't a roof. It was to be owed to somebody, to matter to one small person who expected him on Sundays and would be let down if he wasn't there. Honor is a thing the world does to you from a distance. Being expected is a thing that happens up close. And it was the up-close thing he had been dying without. Ruby gave it to him without ever knowing she was giving anything at all. She'd sit on the end of his bed and tell him about the 3rd grade, and he'd tell her, slowly, across a winter of Sundays, about 11 men and a wire and the one name he'd carried alone too long. And one afternoon, Cody heard his daughter say, in her plain, flat 7-year-old way, "But you went back 4 times. You only have 2 arms. You can't catch everybody with 2 arms." And he watched 41 years finally loosen their grip on the old man's chest, undone at last, not by a general or a ceremony, but by a child stating an obvious fact. And once, near the end of a visit, Otis Kane took Cody's hand in both of his and said, "Your father, the one you told me about, the one who disappeared." Cody had told him, one night, the whole of it. "He didn't disappear, son. You just carried him too now. Every cold man you ever stopped for was him. You've been going back for him your whole life, 4 times, 5, however many it takes. You never once left him out there. You just couldn't reach him in time. That's not the same as leaving." The old man's grip tightened. "Let it go now. You did the thing. You're doing it." Cody Harmon put his head down on an old soldier's hands, and finally, 22 years too late and right on time, said goodbye to his father. Cody kept his job at the terminal. Ames was right. The new work didn't pay, and a man has rent. But he worked the outreach on his days off and his nights off and in the margins of a tired life. And it turned out there were more people willing to help than the world had let him believe. You just had to ask them to stand a post instead of write a check. The program got a name. They called it Cal's Watch, after a man buried in a numbered plot, so that the name that the world had let close over like water would be spoken now every single time somebody went out into the cold to bring one of the lost ones home. Chet Loomis ran the overnight volunteer line. He was good at it. It turned out the same man who'd memorized every rule against getting involved knew exactly where a forgotten soldier goes to be invisible, because he'd spent 9 years not looking at those same places. Cody still stood his post at the terminal most nights in the fluorescent hum. But he stood it differently now. When someone blew in off the street, too cold to sit in, he didn't call it in and he didn't move them along. He put on a pot of bad coffee, and he sat with them a while, and he asked them their name, and he wrote it down, because a name written down is a person who can't be lost. And he had learned the hard way what it cost to lose one. Ruby kept the coin. She kept it on her nightstand where she could see it, and when she was older and understood what it meant, she'd tell the story to anybody who'd listen. About the coldest one on the bench, and the coat, and the 2 coins that matched, and the general who knelt on the floor, but she always told it the same way at the end, in the words she'd learned from her father, who'd learned them from his, the words that turned out to be the whole of it, the only inheritance that had ever mattered passing down one more time, warm from hand to hand in the cold. You don't leave a man alone at his post, not the coldest one, not your father, not the ghost the world agreed to forget. You give him your coat, and you sit with him, and you write down his name. And if you're very lucky and very stubborn, sometimes 41 years later, somebody comes back for him. Cal's Watch is still running. It is not a large organization, and it never became one. It is a phone line and a handful of people who can't walk past, and a spreadsheet of names that gets a little shorter every winter and a little longer every spring, the way the work does. It does not make anyone famous. Nobody wins anything. Most nights it is just a tired person in a cold car driving to an underpass with a thermos and a blanket and a willingness to sit down next to a stranger and ask him his name and write it down. But every so often, not often, but enough to keep the phone answered, One of the lost ones turns out to be someone the world spent decades pretending it had never owed anything to. And a name that had closed over like water gets spoken out loud again. And a family that gave up hoping gets a phone call that puts them on the floor of their own kitchen. It happens just often enough. Otis Kane would tell you that is how it always was out on the wire. You do not go back in because you expect to save everyone. You go back in because leaving is the one thing you swore you'd never do. And a man is only ever as good as the last promise he refused to break. Somebody always should. That was the whole thing. That was all it had ever been.